My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old, and I need to tell you something that still keeps me awake at night. Even now, even after everything has been resolved and the man responsible is behind bars. It started on a Tuesday morning in November. My mother-in-law called me at 7 a.m. and she was screaming. Not crying, screaming. She said my husband had been in a serious accident the night before. She said he was unconscious in a hospital 3 states away. She said I needed to come immediately because the doctors weren't sure he was going to make it. I told her that was impossible. My husband was standing 6 feet away from me in our kitchen, pouring his morning coffee. Before I tell you what I found out next, I want to ask you to subscribe to Heart Path Stories and drop your country in the comments. It means more than you know. Now let me tell you everything. My husband Ryan and I had been married for 4 years when this happened. We met in college, stayed together through grad school, through job changes, through the death of his father and the illness of mine. We were the kind of couple that other people described as solid. Not flashy, not dramatic, just genuinely, quietly in love with each other. Ryan was an architect. He traveled sometimes for work, flying out to oversee construction projects for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. I worked from home as a graphic designer, so our life had a comfortable rhythm. When he was away, I kept busy with client work and weekend plans with my friends. When he was home, we cooked together, watched movies, took long walks on Sunday mornings. Simple, peaceful, exactly what I had always wanted. The week before my mother-in-law called, Ryan had returned from a project in Denver. He'd been gone 16 days. I remembered picking him up from the airport, the way he dropped his bag at the door and pulled me into a hug before he even took off his shoes. I remembered thinking how glad I was to have him home. So when my mother-in-law's voice came through my phone that Tuesday morning, shaking and barely coherent, telling me that Ryan had been airlifted to a hospital in Nashville after a car accident on a highway I had never heard of, my first instinct was simply to correct her. "That's not possible," I said, watching my husband pour 2 mugs of coffee the way he always did, his back to me, humming something under his breath. "He's right here." She stopped screaming for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Claire, he called me last night to say he had a quick stop to make in Tennessee before coming home. He never made it." I looked at my husband. He had turned around. He was watching me with the same concerned expression he always wore when something was wrong, his head tilted slightly, eyebrows pulled together. I told her I would call her back. Ryan set my coffee on the counter and asked what was happening. I explained it as calmly as I could. He frowned. He said his mother must have gotten confused. He said he came straight home from Denver. No stops, no detours. He even pulled up his flight confirmation on his phone and handed it to me. Direct flight. 2 days ago. Landed at our local airport at 4:27 in the afternoon, which was exactly when I'd picked him up. Everything matched. I called my mother-in-law back. She was no longer screaming, but she was sobbing, and between the sobs she was saying things that made no sense to me. She kept saying, "It's him, Claire. I've seen him. I've been to the hospital. It's my son." I didn't know what to do with that. Ryan suggested, gently, that she might be having some kind of episode. She was in her late 60s. She'd had health scares before. He said maybe I should drive down to see her, help her sort things out, and that he would stay home and work on a project proposal that was due by the end of the week. He said it all very reasonably. He kissed my forehead when I left. The drive to my mother-in-law's was 40 minutes. I spent all 40 of them telling myself it was a misunderstanding. She was waiting on her porch when I pulled into her driveway. Her eyes were swollen. She grabbed both of my hands before I could even speak. "I need you to come to the hospital with me," she said. "Right now. Please. I want to be honest about something, because I know some of you might be asking why I didn't just bring my husband along to clear everything up immediately. And the answer is that, in the moment, I thought I was going to a hospital to comfort a confused elderly woman who had somehow mistaken someone else for her son. I didn't think there was anything to clear up. I thought Ryan had been right. I thought she needed me, not him. The hospital was a 2-hour drive from her house. We barely spoke the entire way. She kept her hands folded in her lap and stared out the passenger window, and every few minutes she would exhale slowly, like someone trying to keep from falling apart. When we arrived, a nurse led us down a corridor to a private room. My mother-in-law stopped outside the door and looked at me. "I need you to be ready," she said. I almost smiled. I almost said, "Ready for what?" Because I still believed, completely and fully, that there was a rational explanation waiting for me on the other side of that door. I walked in. The man in the bed was Ryan. Not someone who resembled Ryan. Not someone with similar features or the same hair color. It was Ryan. His face, his hands. The small scar on his left jawline from a bicycle accident when he was 12. His wedding ring on his finger, which I had placed there myself 4 years ago at the altar of a church in Vermont. I grabbed the door frame. The monitors beeped steadily. A nurse adjusted something near the IV stand. My mother-in-law came to stand beside me, and she took my hand, and she said, very softly, "I know." The doctor who came to speak with us explained that the man had been found unresponsive in a vehicle on Interstate 40 east of Nashville. No signs of another car involved. They suspected something had been added to his drink before he drove, causing him to lose consciousness at the wheel. He had been in a coma for nearly 18 hours. His identification showed his name as Ryan Callahan. His insurance card matched. His emergency contact was listed as his wife, Claire Callahan, and the number listed was mine. I stood there, and I thought about the man at home in my kitchen, who had poured my coffee and kissed my forehead and called his own mother confused. I excused myself and walked to the end of the hallway, and I called my husband. He answered, on the second ring. His voice was warm. He asked how my mother-in-law was doing. I said she was okay. I asked him something I already knew the answer to. I asked him what color tie he had worn to our wedding. There was a very short pause. Then he said, "Navy blue with a small silver stripe." He was right. I went back to my mother-in-law. I sat beside her in that hospital room, and I looked at the man in the bed, and I did not know who to believe or what to trust or what was happening to my life. I drove home that evening without answers. My mother-in-law wanted to call the police immediately, but I asked her to give me 24 hours. I don't fully understand why I asked for that. Some part of me was still clinging to the possibility of a rational explanation. Some part of me was terrified that if I called the police and accused the man in my house of being an impersonator, and I was wrong, and it turned out to be some enormous misunderstanding, I would have destroyed everything. So, I went home. And I acted normal. The man in my kitchen had made dinner. Pasta, which was Ryan's specialty. He had used Ryan's recipe, the one his mother had written on an index card that we kept tucked to the inside of a cabinet door. He poured wine. He asked about my day. He said something funny about the neighbor's dog. He loaded the dishwasher the way Ryan always did, rinsing each plate first even though I had told him 100 times it was unnecessary. I watched him do all of this, and I felt the ground shifting slowly beneath me. That night I lay beside him in our bed, and I kept my breathing slow and even, and I stared at the ceiling for hours while he slept. He smelled like Ryan's cologne. But there was something underneath it, something I couldn't name, something not quite right. I had shared a bed with my husband for 6 years, and I knew the particular weight of his presence beside me, the specific rhythm of his breathing. This was close. It was very, very close. But it was not identical. I told myself I was imagining things. I didn't sleep. The next morning, while he was in the shower, I did something I had never done in our marriage. I went through his phone. I found nothing unusual. Every contact was familiar. Every text thread was consistent with conversations I remembered having. His photos were Ryan's photos. His apps were Ryan's apps. Whoever this person was, if he was someone other than my husband, he had prepared with extraordinary thoroughness. But then I found one small thing that stopped me cold. In his saved photos, buried in a folder simply labeled work, was a picture of me that I had never seen before. Not a photo I had taken. Not a photo from our shared albums. It was me, from behind, on what looked like a Saturday morning at the farmer's market near our house. I was wearing a yellow jacket. My hair was down. I had no idea it had been taken. Someone had been watching me before this started. I put the phone back exactly where I found him. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, and I began to understand, slowly and terribly, that I was not imagining things. I needed help, but I couldn't go to anyone who might say something to him. I couldn't risk him knowing I was suspicious. So, I thought carefully about who I could trust, and I landed on the one person who I knew would believe me without asking too many questions first. My older sister. I called her from my car, 2 blocks away from our house, engine running, doors locked. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is not something she normally does. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Does Ryan have a brother?" I said no. Ryan was an only child. His father had died 6 years earlier. His mother was the only family he had left. My sister said, "Are you sure?" I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I had only ever known what Ryan had told me. And people don't usually lie about something like that. But people also don't usually end up in 2 places at once. I called my mother-in-law that afternoon, while the man in my house was on a work call in the study with the door closed. I asked her, very carefully, whether Ryan had any siblings she had never told me about. The silence that followed was the longest 10 seconds of my life. Then she started crying. She told me something she had kept hidden for 32 years. When Ryan was born, he had a twin brother. His name was Ethan. She and her husband had struggled financially when the boys were very young, and there were other complications she didn't want to detail over the phone. When the boys were 3 years old, Ethan had gone to live with his father's brother, a man who lived across the country and who had agreed to raise him. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. It became permanent. Over the years, contact faded. She had not spoken to Ethan since the boys were teenagers. She had heard, some years back, that he had gotten into serious trouble. She had assumed, or perhaps chosen to assume, that he was simply no longer a presence in any of their lives. She had never told Ryan. She had convinced herself over decades that it was a wound better left closed. My hands were trembling so hard I almost dropped my phone. I am not going to tell you that what happened next was easy or logical or clean. I am going to tell you what actually happened, including the parts where I made decisions that might not make sense to you on the outside. I did not call the police that afternoon. I know that might be the first thing you would have done, and if you had, you would not be wrong. But here is what was stopping me. The man in my house had Ryan's face, Ryan's voice, Ryan's memories, Ryan's phone, Ryan's ID, and 6 years of shared history that he had clearly studied down to the smallest detail. If I called the police and said there was an impersonator in my home, the first thing they would see is a man who could prove he was Ryan Callahan more convincingly than I could prove he wasn't. And the real Ryan was still in a coma. He couldn't speak for himself. Without him, without more evidence, I had a photograph taken from behind at a farmer's market and a feeling in my chest that something was wrong. Feelings don't hold up in a courtroom. So, I waited. And I gathered. Over the following 10 days, I became a different person. Outwardly, I was a normal wife. I cooked meals. I watched television. I went to bed at a normal hour. I laughed at his jokes. I let him hold my hand. And every single spare moment I had, I was building a case. I contacted Ryan's colleague at the architecture firm, a woman named Dana who had been on the Denver project with him. I told her I was trying to reconcile some travel expenses and asked when exactly Ryan had left the site. She checked her records and told me that Ryan had left Denver 3 days earlier than his scheduled departure. He had told the team he was making a personal stop before flying home. No one had heard from him since. She had assumed he was back home with me. He had never made it to our local airport. The flight confirmation on the impersonator's phone was not Ryan's real flight. It was a different flight entirely, booked under Ryan's name. From Denver, for the correct date. Someone had bought a second ticket to create a paper trail and then shown me that trail deliberately, knowing I would look. I thought about the fact that he had handed me that phone willingly, confidently. He had wanted me to see it. That is when I understood how long this had been planned. I drove back to the hospital without telling anyone. The real Ryan was no longer in a coma. He had regained consciousness 2 days earlier and was being kept for observation. My mother-in-law had been visiting every day, and she had been very careful, following my instructions. Not to mention any of this to hospital staff yet. When I walked into his room and he turned his head and saw me, his entire face changed. He said my name the way he had always said it, like it cost him something real to hold it in. I sat beside his bed and I held his hand, and the difference was immediate and absolute, not in the way he looked, but in the weight of it, the specific warmth. The way his thumb moved when he held my hand, this small, automatic gesture that I had never once consciously noticed until I spent 10 days next to someone who didn't do it. We talked for almost 2 hours. He told me he remembered very little after leaving Denver. He had stopped for gas somewhere in Tennessee. He had bought a bottle of water inside the station. After that, nothing until the hospital room. Toxicology had found a sedative compound in his system. It had been introduced to something he consumed before getting back on the highway. He had been targeted. The accident had been engineered. I showed him the photo from the impersonator's phone. He stared at it for a long time. Then he looked at me and asked me if I knew about Ethan. I told him I had recently found out. He said he had known for years. His mother had told him when he was 19, after a letter arrived at the house from his father's family. He had never pursued contact. He had told himself that a brother he had never known was not a loss he needed to mourn. He had buried it and moved on. He said, looking at the photo of me at the farmer's market, that he wondered now whether Ethan had made contact in a different way. Whether Ethan had found him first, years ago, and had simply never introduced himself. I had 10 days of evidence by the time I was ready to act. I had financial transfer records that my sister had helped me obtain through a contact she had at a bank where Ethan had apparently held an account. I had correspondence between Ethan and a private investigator, which had been subpoenaed as part of another matter years earlier and was part of a public court record I had found after 3 days of searching. I had phone records showing calls made from our house to a number registered to a prepaid device, calls that happened only when I was not in the room. I had a statement from Dana at the architecture firm. I had the toxicology report. I had my mother-in-law's testimony about Ethan's history and his known instability. And I had one more thing. I had found, at the back of the closet in our study, behind a box of old tax files, a notebook that was not Ryan's. I knew it wasn't Ryan's because I had organized that closet myself 18 months earlier and there had been no notebook there. Inside, it were handwritten notes. Dates, my schedule. Details about our house, our routines, our finances. Notes about Ryan's travel patterns going back nearly 2 years. Ethan had not decided to do this on impulse. He had been building toward it for a very long time. I chose my moment carefully. Ethan had been pushing for several weeks to update our joint financial accounts and add his name to a property trust I held independently. He said it was just practical. He said it was what married couples should do. He had brought it up casually, several times, always dropping it when I deflected, never pushing hard enough to raise suspicion. I told him I was ready to move forward with it. I said I had set up a meeting with our estate attorney. He smiled at me across the breakfast table like everything had gone exactly according to plan. The morning of the meeting, I got up early and made coffee and set it in front of him, and I looked at his face, at Ryan's face. And I felt something I did not expect, not hatred, not satisfaction. Something that felt more like grief. Grief for whatever had made a person want this. Grief for the version of a brother that Ryan might have had. Grief for the 10 days I had spent next to someone who was not my husband, in my home, in my bed, in my life. Then I thought about Ryan lying on a hospital bed. And the grief became something harder. We drove to the attorney's office together. Ethan sat beside me in the passenger seat, relaxed, making small talk, completely unaware that Ryan's colleague Dana was already at the office. That my sister was already at the office. That my mother-in-law was already at the office. That 2 detectives from the county sheriff's department were waiting in an adjacent conference room. We sat down across from the attorney. Documents were placed on the table. Ethan reached for a pen. I said I wanted to take care of one small matter first. I said I had been experiencing some confusion about our family history and that I had recently come across some information I thought everyone should be aware of before we signed anything. I placed the notebook on the table. I watched his hand stop moving. I said, calmly and without raising my voice, that I had spent the past 10 days documenting everything. I said that Ryan Callahan, my husband, was currently recovering in a hospital 2 hours away and was prepared to give a statement to law enforcement at any time. I said that the man sitting across from me was not Ryan Callahan but was Ethan Callahan, Ryan's twin brother, who had orchestrated a deliberate plan to incapacitate my husband and assume his identity for the purpose of accessing my financial assets and property. Ethan stood up. He said nothing at first. He just stood there, looking at me across the table. And for one moment, the expression on his face was not Ryan's expression at all. It was something rawer and stranger than anything my husband's face had ever held. Something that looked, and I say this without any satisfaction, like a person realizing that the thing they wanted most in the world had just slipped completely out of reach. Then the door opened. It took less than 4 minutes. I did not cry in the conference room. I waited until I was in my car, alone, doors locked, and then I sat there in the parking garage and shook for a very long time. The charges were substantial: identity fraud, aggravated assault, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, tampering with a vehicle, unlawful use of personal identification. The toxicology report connected him directly to what happened on that Tennessee highway. The notebook connected him to years of premeditated planning. His attorney argued that his difficult childhood had left him with an unhealthy fixation, that he had grown up watching from a distance a life that had been denied to him, that his obsession had grown gradually into something he could no longer control. I don't know how much of that I believe. I don't know how much of it matters. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Ryan came home in January, 3 months after the night my mother-in-law first called me screaming. He was thinner. He walked slowly at first, carefully, like someone relearning where his edges were. We stood in the entryway of our house, and I held on to him for a long time without saying anything, my face against his shoulder, listening to the particular rhythm of his breathing. He smelled like himself. I want to be honest about the part that still stays with me. Not the fear, not even the anger. The part that stays with me is the knowing that for 10 days, someone used my trust as a weapon. Every moment of warmth I extended, every meal I shared, every night I lay beside him, became something that person was calculating and counting and using. That is the thing that takes the longest to put down. But here is what I also know. I know that love, real love, the love that lives in the daily, unremarkable texture of a life shared with someone, is not easy to copy. It leaves marks too specific to replicate. The way Ryan holds a coffee mug, the way he pauses before he laughs, the way his thumb moves when he holds my hand. These things are small, they are ordinary, but they are also, it turns out, the things that are hardest to steal. Ethan had Ryan's face. He had his voice. He had his history and his memories and his phone and his wedding ring. But he didn't have any of those things. And somewhere, underneath everything, I knew it. That knowledge is the thing I hold on to now. Not the fear, not the grief, just the quiet, stubborn certainty that something real cannot be fully replaced by even the most careful imitation. And the man who tried to replace my husband lost everything he had spent years building toward. While my husband came home,